Hello everyone and welcome to another installment of Modded KSP, where we'll be picking up where we left off last time, having just unlocked a couple of important techs that will help keep us moving forward. I hinted last time that we were going to make use of the new surface deployed science experiments, and at this point there conveniently was a contract available to collect 50% of the surface deployed mystery goo experiment on Minmus, which is perfect. In the VAB, I set to work making a much beefier Minmus lander than the one we used previously. Since the surface deployed parts benefit from deployment by an appropriate type of Kerbal, we're using the large Sputnik capsule we unlocked last episode so that we can bring a pilot, scientist, and engineer to Minmus's surface. We don't have any Minmus science left to collect from the Materials Bay experiment, but there is a bit of science left to get from the mystery goo container, so we're going to slap one on here. We're also making use of a few of the parts we unlocked last episode. These wider landing legs are much more appropriate for manned landers than the teensy tiny ones we used for the Mun lander last episode that ended up being quite a pain. We're also using these flat cargo storage containers to bring along our very first set of surface deployed experiments, now that we've unlocked all the essential parts. The main challenge with this craft is that the large Sputnik capsule is much heavier than either of the other two, coming in just under 2,300 kilograms. The other two capsules have a mass that correlates with their crew capacity. The KV-2 capsule comes in at about 1,500 kilograms, and the KV-1 is just under 800 kilograms. As a result, the payload mass of this craft is significantly higher than any of the other landers we've used before, and we need a pretty beefy rocket despite only traveling to Minmus. This rocket uses the same core launch stage as our previous Mun lander, with a skipper accompanied by 4 Thud engines. However, we're making use of the fuel lines here to make our first asparagus staged rocket. In asparagus staging, you have multiple pairs of liquid fuel boosters attached radially around the rocket. The pairs are decoupled in sequence, with fuel lines between them so that all of the spacecraft's engines effectively run off of one pair of boosters' fuel. The end result is that you can add several liquid-fueled boosters while hanging on to unnecessary mass for as short a time as possible. Once we have this craft in orbit, we conduct our transfer in the same fashion we've seen before. Once we reach low space around Minmus, we can enable the mystery goo container. While approaching Minmus, I decided to land in a lowlands biome, since it's probably the flattest biome we haven't visited yet. Once we're on the ground, the large landing legs mean that the spacecraft has not the slightest inclination to tip over, even with SAS and Smart ASS disabled. Our crew can then perform their necessary EVA duties. The wiki says that the game can be a bit finicky about what order the surface parts are deployed in. They may well have fixed this a while ago, but I followed the order on the wiki just to be safe. First, our scientist Edgus gets out to collect an EVA report, surface sample, and use Minmus as his personal driving range before getting out and setting up the surface deployed mystery goo observation. With Edgus back inside, our engineer Bill is up next. He plants a flag on the moon's surface, completing our contract, and also sets up the experiment control station before putting down the solar panels. We luckily don't need the surface deployed communitron antenna since we're close enough to home. With all of our crew back inside the capsule, we wait for the last experiments on the vessel to finish and depart for Minmus. After coasting to apoapsis, we circularize and plan our maneuver to return to Kerbin. Shortly after the ejection burn, I remembered we have to do EVA science in space around Minmus, and managed to hurriedly cancel out of time warp before leaving Minmus's sphere of influence. We'll have to do the low space EVA experiment another time, but oh well. This was an otherwise uneventful return, luckily for the crew. Back at the KSC, we have 115 science, but the only 90 cost tech left to unlock is recycling, which isn't of the utmost importance at the moment. The logical next step is to conduct the same type of mission on the Mun. In mission control, I picked up a contract to plant a flag on the Mun, as well as rescue Joffred Kerbin from its orbit. In the VAB, I started designing a craft but ran into a significant roadblock. The high delta V demands of the Mun in comparison to Minmus mean that the extra payload mass from the capsule inflates the size of our rocket dramatically, to the point that the rocket I eventually came up with can't be launched without upgrading the launch pad. This mission will have to wait for the time being. In the interim, I decided to work on obtaining landing rights at a few more airports in the area to eventually work towards getting some profitable airline contracts. The first of these is the Welcome Island Airport, which is about 100 kilometers east out into the ocean. I conducted the whole landing in the IVA, so I'll narrate along with what I'm doing. After entering the IVA away from the airfield, I set up the monitors for navigation. The monitor on the right is showing a map generated using the ScanSat data, specifically a biome map. The monitor on the left is showing the instrument landing system. At first I had the ILS set to Island 09, but this is actually the Island Airfield, which is different from the Welcome Island. Welcome 09 is the setting we're looking for. The ILS is set to Welcome 09R because you're going to be landing with a heading of 90 degrees on the runway to our right. As we approach, we want to keep an eye on the ILS icons. The tick mark at the very top of the dial always stays fixed, and the dial rotates around it depending on the direction our craft is currently moving, also known as the craft's heading. The purple line split across the top and bottom with the small line through it indicates the direction along the runway's course, which in this case is 90 degrees as the runway runs directly east to west. The outlined blocky arrow indicates the direction from our craft to the runway, aka the runway's bearing. The purple line that runs up and down and can move from side to side across the dial represents how far away the aircraft is from the runway horizontally, or in other words, how far to our left or right we have to move to line up with the runway. This isn't the best example since the footage starts when we're already pretty well lined up, but the gist is that we look at the runway's course and bearing and to change our aircraft's heading until the runway's bearing is between our heading and the runway course. It essentially works like the rendezvous analogy I made back in episode 6, where we're using our heading to push the bearing marker onto the course marker. When we're closer to our target, it's hard to tell where the markers are in relation to each other, which is where the side-to-side moving line comes into play. It essentially is a representation of where the runway is on the dial. In this case, we can see that the runway is still a little bit to our right, so we need our heading to be a little bit to the right of 90 degrees to keep moving towards it. You want to be able to have this line up with all of the other markers by the time you're landing. As we get closer still, our purple moving line is replaced by a yellow moving line. This is the fine control line to give us an even more detailed picture once we're close enough to meaningfully do something about it. I've also changed the display on the right to a landing mode using the camera on the bottom of the plane, which displays information like radar altitude and vertical speed. Now, off to the side of the ILS, there are a pair of identical displays of a little triangle moving up and down on these gauges. I didn't do a particularly good job of it here, but these markers indicate whether or not you're in the glide slope, which is an arbitrary slope that you choose for your descent, depending on how gentle you want to descend and what the terrain will allow. Triangles at the top mean you're below the glide slope and need to pitch up. Triangles at the bottom mean you're above the glide slope and need to pitch down. If you keep the triangles straight in the center as you descend, you will come down right after the beginning of the runway. After going all the way down the runway, since braking is still being weird with these fixed landing gears, we can head to the quote-unquote terminal, which for this base appears to just be the middle of the airfield near these small hangars. After waiting a bit, we can taxi out to the other runway and take off to return home. Back at base, we do the same procedure with the ILS set to KSC ILS 27, the KSC runway going west. After this mission was completed, I set out to unlock 2 other airfields, which I both remembered by name, although I couldn't put my finger on why at first. The why, as it turns out, is that both of these places are extremely finicky, and I remembered being extremely annoyed at them in an older save of mine. Smusgrave is fine at approach, but as we near the runway, you may notice something peculiar. Yeah, the whole place is levitating off the ground. I need to find who constructed this airfield to inquire if we can incorporate some of their clearly advanced technologies into our space program. There's one other annoying quirk with Smusgrave, which is that the runway, for whatever reason, seems to have bumps in its collision mesh every so often that made me crash multiple times trying to lift off from this place. After that struggle, I have moved on to the island airfield. In contrast to Smusgrave, there's nothing wrong with the runway here other than it being rather short. However, the instrument landing system is calibrated to completely the wrong place, and I had to hastily readjust my approach. With these 2 incredibly frustrating missions completed, we've done a good amount of work for our airline for the time being, and at the very least, we don't have to go to either of these places again. At this point, I poked around for some more missions to do, and saw something that should be pretty achievable, putting a satellite in a polar orbit around the Mun with a mystery goo canister attached. I set to work building the satellite in the VAB, which was pretty straightforward. The vessel was launched, and I conducted a transfer to come in over the Mun's pole before running into a very unfortunate snag. Shortly before the Mun capture, the probe ran out of power in the exact orientation to leave it dead without any sun exposure. As you may imagine, I was very angry and frustrated at this point. I evidently redid the mission. When I went back to check working on this video, the satellite was in orbit and we had completed the contract, but I unfortunately don't have any footage for that. On that lackluster note, I'm going to end the episode here. The Minmus mission yielded quite a lot of science for us, and our airline expansion and Munsat earned us a small sum of funds. Next episode, I have some more interesting things on the cards, so make sure to stay tuned.